Prison guards, what's the wildest story you can't tell? There was an inmate named Silas who had been inside for 12 years and hadn't said a single word. We all just assumed he was mute. He'd gesture, write on a small notepad, but never made a sound. One evening, I was doing my rounds, and as I passed his cell, he whispered my name. I almost jumped out of my skin. He pressed his face to the bars and said, "Don't go into the laundry room. Thompson has a shiv made from the dryer drum, and he's waiting for you." He described the weapon perfectly. I called for backup, and sure enough, we found Thompson hiding behind the industrial press, exactly where Silas said he'd be, holding a sharpened piece of metal. Silas never spoke another word after that night. He saved my life with the only sentence he'd spoken in over a decade. During a surprise inspection, we tossed a cell belonging to a guy in for forgery. We expected to find contraband, maybe a weapon. Instead, under his bunk, we found the entire prison. He had spent months building a perfect-to-scale replica of the whole facility. It was made from meticulously chewed and molded toilet paper, hardened with soap, and painted with crushed-up colored pencils he'd smuggled from the art program. Every building, every guard tower, every fence was there. He'd even used his own hair to represent the razor wire. The detail was breathtaking. The warden was so impressed he didn't even write the guy up. He just confiscated it and put it on display in the administration building. It was the most bizarre and impressive thing I'd ever seen. The most feared man on the block was a guy named Rook. He was the head of a violent gang, covered in tattoos, and had a stare that could make your blood run cold. He never talked to guards, never showed any emotion. Around Christmas, I was having a rough time. My wife was going through chemotherapy, and we had a newborn at home. The whole prison knew. One day, Rook called me over to his cell, which was unheard of. He pushed a tightly wrapped package through the bars. "For the little one," he grunted. I opened it later to find a perfectly knitted, incredibly soft baby blanket. He had spent 6 months trading every valuable commissary item he had for yarn and knitting needles. The most dangerous man I'd ever met had a heart after all. Chapel services were usually the calmest time of the week. Not this time. We started getting reports of inmates acting drunk, getting loud and aggressive during the sermon. It made no sense. We did a shakedown and eventually found the source in a cell belonging to a quiet inmate named Deacon. He was a religious guy who always carried his Bible. Except this Bible was hollowed out. Inside, he had managed to create a miniature still. He'd been fermenting fruit smuggled from the kitchen, using a heating coil made from a broken radio to brew some of the most potent moonshine I've ever smelled. He'd been selling it for weeks. The sermon turned into a full-blown riot, all because one guy turned his holy book into a secret distillery. We had a guy on death row, scheduled for execution in less than a week. He was in for a double homicide and had been a model prisoner, quiet, never caused trouble. A few days before his sentence was to be carried out, he called for the warden. He said he wanted to confess to something else. Detectives from another state flew in. The inmate proceeded to lay out in perfect detail his involvement in the famous Highway 29 vanishing, a cold case from 30 years ago where a young couple disappeared without a trace. He knew details only the killer could know, including where he'd buried the bodies. He said he wanted their families to have closure before he died. He was executed 2 days later, having solved one of the country's biggest mysteries from inside his cell. You see, inmates do crazy things to get out of work or to get a trip to the infirmary, but this was on another level. We had this one guy who was obsessed with a particular daytime soap opera. One afternoon, another inmate changed the channel on the common room TV, and the two started arguing. Before a fight could break out, we cuffed the soap opera fan and put him in a holding cell to cool off. 10 minutes later, the emergency call light goes on. We rush in, and he's standing by the cell door uncuffed. He had deliberately and forcefully dislocated his own shoulder, making it small enough to slip his hand right through the cuff. He then popped it back into place. All that pain and effort just so he could get out of his cuffs and try to change the channel back. A massive fight broke out in the yard between the leaders of two rival gangs. It was brutal, or so we thought. We sounded the alarm, and every available guard ran to the yard to break it up. It took us nearly 10 minutes to get the situation under control. As we were dragging the inmates to solitary, a call came over the radio from the kitchen. It was a mess cook, whispering frantically. The entire fight was a diversion. While every guard was focused on the yard, 3 other members of their gangs had slipped into the kitchen, climbed into the industrial ventilation system, and were crawling their way toward the roof. If that cook hadn't noticed them, they would have made it out. It was the most elaborately choreographed piece of theater I've ever witnessed. There was an inmate in the psych ward everyone called Ghost Talker. He was in for arson and claimed he could communicate with the dead. Most of us just ignored his rambling. One day, he stopped me as I walked past his cell. He got a strange, distant look in his eyes and said, "Your grandfather says he's sorry about the watch." I froze. My grandfather had passed away years ago, and just a week prior, I had accidentally dropped his antique pocket watch, my most prized possession, and cracked the glass. I kept it hidden in my locker at work. No one knew about it, and I'd never spoken of it. The inmate then described the watch perfectly, down to the small eagle engraved on the back. I have no explanation for it. It still creeps me out to this day. The prison was on lockdown for 3 straight days due to a major security threat. Tensions were high, and inmates were getting restless, banging on their doors. Then, on the 3rd night, the A block went completely silent. We were terrified, thinking they were planning something. I crept up to the block and peeked through the security window. What I saw was unbelievable. The inmates had organized a secret talent show. They were taking turns standing at their cell doors, singing, reciting poetry, and telling jokes. A guy in for life was the judge, and they had created a prize out of a bag of ramen noodles and a candy bar. In the middle of a tense lockdown, they had found a way to create a moment of pure, unadulterated humanity. An inmate named Carl was a disbarred lawyer in for fraud. He was a nightmare, not because he was violent, but because he knew the rule book better than the warden. He started filing grievances, hundreds of them. They were all technically legitimate: a chipped tile in the shower, a flickering light in the library, a draft from a window. Eventually, he found an obscure state regulation from the 1950s stating that all state-run facilities had to be painted in calming pastel colors for inmate morale. Our prison was gray concrete. He filed a lawsuit. The state, unwilling to fight a costly legal battle, settled. The next month, painters arrived and, on Carl's legally binding recommendation, painted the entire maximum security facility a bright Pepto-Bismol pink. We noticed one inmate was getting a huge amount of money deposited into his commissary account. He was in for a minor charge, so it seemed suspicious. We started monitoring his visitation calls with his wife. They seemed normal, just talking about their kids and what was on TV. Then one of our analysts cracked it. They were speaking in code. When his wife mentioned their son's baseball stats, she was actually relaying stock market prices. His advice on what TV shows to watch was his buy or sell orders. This guy was running a full-blown day trading operation from a prison phone. He had made over $100,000 in 6 months. It was the most sophisticated white-collar crime I'd ever seen committed from inside a cell. A 70-year-old inmate named Abe was in for writing bad checks. He was frail, quiet, and mostly kept to himself. One day in the library, a huge 25-year-old inmate, in for aggravated assault, cornered a younger kid and started beating him senseless. Before any guards could respond, Abe shuffled over. We thought he was going to get himself killed. The big guy shoved him, but Abe didn't flinch. He just took the newspaper he was reading, rolled it up tightly, and with a speed I couldn't believe, jabbed the end of it squarely into the attacker's throat. The guy collapsed, gasping for air. Abe just unrolled his newspaper and went back to his chair to finish the crossword puzzle. He never said a word about it, but no one ever bothered him or that kid again. We had an inmate who managed to convince half the prison he was a prophet. He was charismatic, and his stories were just believable enough to a desperate audience. It started small, predicting what was for lunch. Then it escalated. He told his followers that he had a vision of them reaching a promised land outside the walls. He instructed them to begin digging. When we did a cell search, we found nearly 30 inmates had been using plastic spoons, smuggled from the cafeteria, to try and tunnel through the concrete walls of their cells. They had barely made a scratch. They genuinely believed their prophet when he told them that on the 7th day of digging, the walls would crumble like Jericho. It was a bizarre mix of faith, desperation, and sheer stupidity. A new guard, fresh out of training, felt sorry for an inmate who claimed his birthday was coming up. The kid was barely 20, and the inmate was a master manipulator. He spun a sob story about his lonely childhood and how he'd never had a birthday cake. The rookie, against every rule, smuggled in a small chocolate cake for him. The next day, we found the inmate's cellmate with a severe gash on his arm. The inmate had let the cake go hard and stale, then sharpened the edge of the plastic plate it came on. He used the hardened cake as a handle, creating a makeshift hatchet. He traded a fake story of sadness for a very real weapon. The rookie was fired on the spot. In prison, routine is everything. Tuesday is pizza night. It is the one thing many inmates look forward to all week. One Tuesday, the kitchen had a supplier issue. No pizza. The replacement meal was meatloaf. When the inmates found out, the entire mess hall fell silent. You could feel the tension instantly. It started with one tray being thrown, then another. Within a minute, we were on the verge of a full-scale riot. We had to deploy tear gas to break it up. It wasn't about the food itself. It was about the one small piece of normalcy they were promised being taken away. I will never forget the sight of 200 men losing their minds over a slice of pepperoni. It's the closest I've ever come to a real prison riot. There was an inmate named Sketch who was a phenomenal artist. He could draw anything with photorealistic detail using just a standard issue pencil. His specialty was food. His cell wall was covered in drawings of juicy cheeseburgers, steaming bowls of pasta, and decadent slices of cake. They looked so real you could almost smell them. It was heartbreaking. Other inmates would pay him with commissary items like a bag of chips or a can of soda, not for a drawing of their own, but just for a 5-minute visit to his cell to look at the drawings on his wall. They were so starved for the simple pleasure of a good meal that they would trade their actual food just to stare at a picture of it. It was a quiet, sad, kind of extreme. You expect to intercept messages written in invisible ink or pass during visits. You don't expect to deal with livestock. One of our tower guards noticed a pigeon landing on the same cell windowsill every day. He got suspicious. We raided the cell and found the inmate had been nursing a pigeon with a broken wing back to health. But this was no pet. Tied to its leg with a piece of thread was a tiny, tightly rolled piece of paper. On it was a hand-drawn map of the prison yard, detailing the blind spots of our security cameras and the patrol schedule of the guards. He had been training a carrier pigeon to smuggle out intel for a planned escape. It was like something out of a medieval war movie. An inmate named Arthur was legally blind. He could see shapes and light, but not much else. He was also the undisputed chess champion of the prison. It was the most incredible thing to watch. He would sit at a table with his back to the board and play against 2 or 3 opponents simultaneously. They would call out their moves, and he would keep the position of every single piece on all 3 boards entirely in his head. He then state his move, and someone would move the piece for him. He never lost. We had chess masters from a local club come in to play him, and he beat them all. He was a genius hiding in plain sight, using his mind to escape the prison in a way no wall could ever stop. The most unassuming inmate I ever met was a guy named Leonard, doing a 5-year stint for tax evasion. He was a portly, balding accountant in his late 50s. He was polite, quiet, and terrified of everyone. We all figured he was just a numbers guy who got caught. During a mandatory psychological evaluation, he was asked about any past crimes. He calmly confessed that, for 2 decades, he had been a contract killer for the mob. He proceeded to detail over a dozen unsolved disappearances and murders, providing information that only the perpetrator could know. The FBI agents who interviewed him were stunned. He wasn't a scared accountant. He was one of the most prolific hitmen they'd ever encountered, hiding behind a pair of bifocals and a pocket protector. The most extreme thing I ever saw started with an inmate faking a heart attack. He was a known prankster, but this time it seemed real. He collapsed, wasn't breathing, and had no pulse. The medical team performed CPR to no avail. He was declared deceased and transported to the prison morgue, a small cold room in the basement. Standard procedure is to leave the body for a 2-hour observation period before it's sent to the county coroner. About an hour in, the guard monitoring the morgue camera saw the body bags start to move. The zipper went down, and the inmate sat bolt upright, looked directly at the camera, and said, "Man, all that hard work made me hungry. Think I could get a sandwich." He'd used a technique to stop his own pulse. The entire prison was in chaos for hours.